Assalamualaikum and good day, dear students. How are you? Hope everyone is doing well and keeping safe. I am Dr. Dania, and today I'm going to share some knowledge on topic 7, which is on the cardiovascular system. So before we start, let's get our brain going by asking ourselves, what is the cardiovascular system? The heart and circulatory system make up our cardiovascular system. So our heart works as a pump that pushes blood to the organs, tissues and cells of our body. So to put it in a science perspective, without our cardiovascular system, we don't exist. We know what its function is, but do we know how it functions? And what diseases of the cardiovascular system can affect the quality of our lives? And how do we treat those diseases? So let's find out.
None of us wants to see someone have a heart attack, especially someone we love. But in a cardiac emergency, knowing what to do is essential for saving a life. The key is to remain calm and take the right steps.
So before we begin the subtopics, let's have a heart-to-heart. And why is the heart important for survival? So in this topic, you will explore this remarkable pump. This pump carries blood into the vessels. So for me, there is no better word to describe the function of the heart other than being a pump, since its contraction develops the pressure that ejects blood into the major vessels, such as the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. So from these vessels, the blood is distributed to the rest or the remainder of the body. So although the term pump, when we hear the word pump, we usually relate it to the mechanical device made of steel or plastic. However, this structure here is a living, sophisticated muscle. So as you go through this chapter, try to keep in your mind or relate the concepts of pump and a muscle. So let's get to know more about our heart. So the heart is a muscular organ just about the size of a fist, and it has the shape of a cone. It is located just behind and slightly left of the breastbone or the sternum. So it lies within a double wall sac called the pericardium, which encases the heart and anchors it inside the chest. The human heart has 4 chambers. 2 upper chambers, we call it as the atria, and the 2 lower ones called the ventricles. So the pink part here is called the septum. The septum separates the heart into the left and the right side, and each side has 2 chambers. Okay, the upper chambers are thin-walled and they receive blood from circulation, while the lower 2 chambers are thick-walled and pump blood away from the heart. The heart also has 4 valves, which direct the flow of blood and prevent its backward movement. So the 2 valves that lie between the atria and the ventricles are called the atrioventricular valves. The atrioventricular valve on the right is called the tricuspid valve because it has 3 flaps. The valve on the left side is called the bicuspid or the mitral valve because it has 2 flaps. The remaining 2 valves are the semilunar valves. The flaps resemble half moon between the ventricles and their attached vessels. So the pulmonary semilunar valve lies between the right ventricle and the pulmonary trunk. So the aortic semilunar valve lies between the left ventricle and the aorta. So when the atrioventricular valves are open, the blood passes from the atria to the ventricles. And when the semilunar valves open, the blood passes out of the heart. The blood vessels functionally divided into 2 distinctive circuits, which is the pulmonary circuit, which transport oxygen-poor blood from the right ventricle to the lung, and the systemic circuit which carries the oxygen-rich blood from the left ventricle out to the capillaries to the tissues of the body. So the blood enters the heart through two large veins which are called the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava. This empties the oxygen poor blood from the body into the right atrium of the heart. So as the atrium contracts, the blood flows from the right atrium into the right ventricle through the open tricuspid valve. So when the ventricle is full, the tricuspid valve shuts. This prevents the blood from flowing backward into the atria while the ventricle contracts. So as the ventricle contracts, the blood leaves the heart through the pulmonary artery and to the lungs where it is oxygenated. So then the pulmonary vein empties the oxygen-rich blood from the lungs into the left atrium of the heart. So as the atrium contracts, the blood flows from the left atrium into the left ventricle through the bicuspid valve. So when the ventricle is full, the bicuspid valve shuts. This prevents the blood from flowing backward into the atrium while the ventricle contracts. So as the ventricle contracts, the oxygen-rich blood leaves the heart into the aorta and to the arteries, eventually into the veins to complete the blood circulation in the body.
We will start our tour of the cardiac cycle with blood returning to the heart and entering the atria. The right atrium receives blood from the systemic circuit. This blood is low in oxygen and high in carbon dioxide. The left atrium receives blood from the lungs via the pulmonary circuit. This blood has a high concentration of oxygen and a low concentration of carbon dioxide. When the atria contract, blood is forced into the ventricles of the heart through the atrioventricular valves. As is the case with all of the valves of the heart, these valves control the flow of blood and prevent the blood from flowing backward through the heart. Once the atria contract, they immediately begin to refill with blood for the next cycle. As the ventricles contract, the blood is directed through the semilunar valves into the arteries. The blood leaving the left ventricle enters a large artery called the aorta, which delivers blood to the organs in the systemic circuit. The blood leaving the right ventricle is delivered via the pulmonary artery to the lungs. The contraction of the atria and ventricles is coordinated so that the atria contract first, followed shortly thereafter by the ventricles.
So next we go on into the heartbeat. So the heartbeat is caused by the heart muscles relaxing and contracting. So the cardiac cycle is defined as a sequence of alternating contraction and relaxation of the atria and ventricles in order to pump blood throughout the body. So it starts at the beginning of one heartbeat and ends at the beginning of another. So each cardiac cycle has a diastolic phase, or we also call it as a diastole, where the heart chamber is in a state of relaxation and fills with blood that receives from the vein, and a systolic phase, also called as the systole, where the heart chambers are contracting and pumps the blood towards the arteries. Okay, so the cardiac cycle starts off with the blood collects in the atria, and then the atria contracts. So this pushes blood through the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves into the lower ventricles. So this phase is the diastole phase, which is the longer of the two, which is longer than the systole. So the second part begins after the ventricles fill. When the ventricle contracts, this phase is called the systole. After blood moves into the pulmonary artery and aorta, the ventricles then relax. Next, we go on into the stages in the cardiac cycle. So when the atria contracts, the ventricle relax and fill with blood. So this means that the atrioventricular valves are open and allows the blood to flow into the ventricle, and the semilunar valves are closed. Then, when the ventricles contract, the atrioventricular valves are closed. This makes the sound lup. So then the semilunar valves are open and permits the blood to pump into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. Lastly, when the heart is relaxed, both the atria and the ventricles are filling with blood. So then the atrioventricular valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. So when the semilunar valves are closed, it makes the sound dub. Pulse and the conduction system. Pulse is the wave effect passing down walls of the arterial blood vessels when the aorta expands and recoils following the ventricular systole, while the conduction system of the heart consists of the cardiac muscle cells and conducting fibers that are specialized for initiating impulse and conducting them rapidly through the heart. The conduction system provides the heart its automatic rhythmic beat for the heart to pump efficiently, and also the systemic and pulmonary circuit to operate in synchronously. The events in the cardiac cycle must be coordinated. So first we have the sinoatrial node, which is the SA node that keeps the heartbeat regular. This is also called the pacemaker, while the atrioventricular node, the AV node, signals the ventricles to contract. So the input from the brain can increase or decrease the rate or the strength of the heart contraction. The hormones epinephrine and also norepinephrine secreted into the bloodstream stimulates the heart and also increase the blood pressure, heart rate, and also blood sugar levels.
Ventricular filling is completed by the contraction of the atria, or atrial systole. The contraction results from a series of events, beginning with the spread of action potentials from the sinoatrial, or SA node, across the walls of the atria. The spread of action potentials results in atrial depolarization, which is represented by the P wave on the electrocardiogram, or ECG. Atrial depolarization leads to contraction, or systole. Atrial systole is represented by the PQ segment on the ECG. Near the end of atrial systole, impulses from the SA node reach the AV node. Impulses spread from the AV node along the branches of the atrioventricular bundle to the Purkinje fibers in the walls of the ventricles. This results in depolarization of the ventricles, which is seen as the QRS complex on the ECG. The atria repolarize, the walls relax, and they remain in diastole for the rest of the cardiac cycle. Atrial repolarization is not seen on an ECG because it is masked by the QRS complex. In ventricular systole, or contraction, increased pressure in the ventricles forces the AV valves closed. The heart sound associated with closure of the AV valve is known as S1 and is described as lub. With continued contraction, ventricular pressures increase until they are higher than those in the pulmonary trunk, and aortic valves open and blood is ejected from the ventricles. Ventricular systole is represented by the ST segment on the ECG. In ventricular diastole, or relaxation, the ventricles repolarize. The T wave on the ECG represents this ventricular repolarization. Ventricular relaxation results in decreasing ventricular pressure. During ventricular diastole, blood in the pulmonary trunk and aorta flows back toward the semilunar valves, causing them to close. The heart sound associated with closure of the aortic and pulmonary valves is known as S2 and is described as dub. After the aortic and pulmonary valves close, pressure in the ventricles continues to decrease. When intraventricular pressure falls below the pressure in the atria, the AV valves open and the cardiac cycle begins.
Electrocardiogram, or the ECG, is a tracing of the electrical activity that is taking place within the heart. So under normal circumstances, an electrical impulse will travel from the sinoatrial node, which is the SA node, spread across the atrium to the atrioventricular node and through the ventricular septum of the heart. So this electrical impulse causes the four chambers of the heart to contract and relax. So if you see this ECG reading, we have the P wave, the QRS complex, and also the T wave. So this P wave here shows that the atria are about to contract, or the QRS complex shows that the ventricles are about to contract and the atria are relaxing, while for the T wave here shows that the ventricular muscle fibers are relaxing or are recovering. Blood pressure. Blood pressure is expressed in the form of a systolic over the diastolic. The normal blood pressure is less than 120/80, so this represents the systolic and the diastolic pressures. Systolic pressure is when the blood falls into the arteries during the ventricular systole, while the diastolic pressure is the pressure in the arteries during the ventricular systole. If you refer to the figure here, you can see that there is a higher blood pressure in the arteries compared to the lower pressure in the veins. So blood flows from the aorta into the arteries and the atrials, and then when it reaches the capillaries, the blood pressure becomes low. And then when it travels down to the vein, the pressure is too low to move blood back to the heart. Because the blood pressure in the vein is too low, it needs factors to facilitate the return of the blood back to the heart. So the first factor we have is the presence of valves. This prevents the backward flow of blood and also to regulate the blood flow in the veins. The second one is the skeletal muscle contraction, which pushes the blood in the veins towards the heart. So this is the contracted skeletal muscle, which pushes the blood past the open valve. When the valve is closed, it prevents the backward flow of the blood. And the last one is we have the respiratory pump, which is the pressure changes in the thorax during breathing. So what happens when these valves in the vein becomes faulty? So this is an example of the varicose vein. This develops when the valves become ineffective. When they become ineffective, they allow blood to flow in the wrong direction or to pool. Okay, so that is all for part 1 of the cardiovascular system. I'll see you all in part 2.